Hey everyone, it's Reed. Before we get started, I need a favor. I need you to help me and my colleagues at the union stay on the road. We have been traveling all across target states in the last few weeks, and we will be on the road between now and Election Day. But we can't do it without your help. I hope you'll go to jointheunion.us and consider making a contribution today. Thank you as always. And now, on with the show. Welcome back to the home front. I'm your host, Reed Galen. Today, I'm joined by a true champion of democracy, Adam Kinzinger. Adam is a former member of Congress from Illinois. He served between 2011 and 2023, and notably served on the bipartisan U.S. House Select Committee on January 6th. He's an Air Force veteran. He flew both tankers and intelligence aircraft, retired as a lieutenant colonel, and is currently the founder of the pro-democracy organization, Country First. Adam, welcome to the show.
Buddy, it's good to be with you. Thanks for having me.
So, I was just reading a little bit back on your background, and as I was telling you right before we went on, I feel like that there are a lot of folks that are listening to this show that probably didn't know much about you until the January 6th committee hearings. That was in the context of pro-democracy, Democrat, Republican, et cetera, that wasn't someone you weren't someone that maybe they had an eye on. But just reading back through your biography, interesting that it was Mike Pence who was someone who convinced you to run for Congress. And let me just ask you, as you were having that conversation with Mike Pence, in that moment, did you ever in your wildest dreams have any idea that however many years hence, you would be where you are and he would be where he is?
Not at all. I mean, look, Mike was, who he was, right? He was kind of a political animal. He had risen in a speed to I guess he was the conference chair at that point. I didn't know much about how that stuff worked, but
right.
No, I mean, look, I always thought, Reed, that not only was our party going to be the party that was a bulwark for democracy, right, but I also thought, like, everybody has a red line that they wouldn't cross. And of course, Republican or Democrat, that red line would be anti-democratic. And so, probably like everybody else, never imagined there'd actually be a real threat to democracy from the inside for our country. So, nope, I just thought I was going to be a guy that maybe went to Congress. I could say I was a congressman, be pretty cool, and that's about it. Go away someday.
Right. And so here you are, look, you obviously served in the Air Force. I think you were a tanker pilot and then an intel pilot. You served overseas many times. And, I think that as I look back again on your background, Adam, very much of the Republican Party that I grew up in, right? Very much a Republican of the party that my dad worked in the late 70s and 80s and 90s, right? Which was, sort of a moral and muscular foreign policy. There was a role for government and it knew its place. And then a fiscal responsibility and personal responsibility. All of that's just out the window.
It is. I mean, look, there's honestly, when people talk about conservative and the Republican Party nowadays, I just we obviously have lost the plot on what conservatism means, because there's nothing conservative about today's GOP. I mean, it's literally just a nationalist party. It's based on anger, based on division and hate. The thing that had drawn me to the Republican Party was I really passionately still believe in America's role in the world, which is, we're a stabilizing force. Obviously, things like Ukraine, when we look at what's going on in Iran with Israel, those kinds of things, that's very important. And so, when I was a kid, I'd hear Ronald Reagan talk about that in such glowing terms. My favorite movie was Red Dawn, for God's sakes. I was destined to be a Republican. And, right. And even George W. Bush, after 9/11, that kind of moral clarity, we can agree or disagree with the wars that came after, but like that moral
that you
clarity. Fought in. Yeah. And that I fought in. That was the thing that drew me. Look, in this idea, I mean, the Republican Party basically, and I may be wrong in saying this, but it really seems like it kind of invented federal infrastructure and a role for the federal government in infrastructure creation. You look at, Abraham Lincoln preserving the Union. You look at Eisenhower building the interstate system. Like, all that is stuff that I really bought into, doing it in a conservative way. So we're not just blowing money. We're doing this the right way. That's gone, obviously, but that's what drew me to the GOP. And I just had an impossible time, thank God, really, getting rid of those values that I was raised with, and succumbing to this dark force of cultism.
You brought up something interesting about the infrastructure piece, because the whole idea and this goes back to even before the Republican Party, was that, the idea of infrastructure was good, not for only the common good, but also for commerce and for economic purposes. And the idea was that better infrastructure led to better economic outcomes. It was easier to move goods and services. It was easier to start a business. It was easier to open a storefront if that was the thing that you were doing at the time. And now it's just like, no, we don't want roads. We don't want bridges. Remember Grover Norquist famously wants to drown government in a bathtub, all of this sorts of thing. And yeah, that's something, we forget is that, yeah, Dwight Eisenhower built the interstate highway system. This was not something that was bad. The idea that there was a role for government, right, I don't think was antithetical to being a Republican or even a conservative. It was what that role of government was. That was the argument, not whether or not it was a good thing.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the argument of, what is conservatism, we want obviously strong economic growth, you can build your own future, that kind of stuff. So, first off, today's Republican Party would never approve something like the interstate system. Never. I mean, like, for God's sakes, you're building roads all across America. What about the Democratic states? Oh my God.
Right.
But, so you look at the investment we made, we've gotten back probably 10,000 times what we invested in that. You look at like rebuilding Germany, rebuilding Japan. You now have an isolationist Republican Party that believes we should not even help Ukraine. We should let Russia destroy it. That, war is the most destructive force out there. And yet our investments in Germany and Japan have come back probably 100 or 1,000-fold of what we invested because of that economic partnership. They've lost the plot. And honestly, this party, I think, really is just a default to the old Confederacy, where the whole idea is the federal government is bad, bring it down. Let's put everything to the states, unless it's like transgender bathrooms, then that's a federal issue. But abortion now is a state issue because we don't want to touch it. It just, there is no rhyme or reason to the party anymore.
Yeah, it's interesting you bring up the Confederacy because the rise of MAGA, the deepest hold of MAGA is in I'll even call it the new Confederacy. But it's interesting is we're recording this. We've just had Hurricane Helene come ashore and do terrible damage. We're now watching Hurricane Milton as we're recording this, growing rapidly into a Category 5. And you were someone who, voted on appropriations bills. You might have even served on a committee that dealt with FEMA or whatever the case might be. But here now it's like, we're not even, all of those members of Congress, many of whom you probably served with, or a governor like Ron DeSantis, who you also served with. And I was like, oh, no. Like, we don't want FEMA. We don't want any help, but we really do want your help, but we don't want to tell anybody about it, but we're not going to vote for it, but we really do want it. And then now just, I saw that, FEMA and the National Hurricane Center, Adam, had issued a mass evacuation order, like get out of the way. And if you look at the comments on Twitter, it's all people like, why should anybody trust FEMA? We don't want to hear from you, all this stuff. And it's fascinating to me that much like COVID, Adam, they're perfectly willing with putting their own people in harm's way, literally in harm's way.
It's so true. And, part of the thing is, look, yes, I mean, we could talk about the distrust of institutions. That's a real issue. Let's do the 10,000-foot overview of why is there a distrust of institutions? Well, because since I was in politics and before that, all we did was run against Washington, D.C. That's what we were always told. You remember that as a political strategist.
Sure,
the best way to win re-election is go back and tell your district that basically you're the only sane person in D.C. and you're going to save them from the federal government. Well, 15 years of convincing people that everybody's corrupt, they're eventually going to believe it. And then, even though I have an uncle, Reed, whose wife died from COVID. He's still a COVID conspiracy theorist. He claims it was something else now. And so you look at what's going on with FEMA. You look at Ron DeSantis, who voted against hurricane relief in New Jersey, right? I voted for it. And look, it's a tough vote because it was like $100 million when the federal deficit was the big thing we were focused on. But I also knew that this is a role of the federal government. Well, now, and Ron DeSantis is doing the right thing by going to the federal government and asking for help. But you have to point out the blatant irony there of the fact that a guy that opposed it for New Jersey is begging for it for Florida. And then he's got constituents that don't even believe it's real. And by the way, on top of that, the number of people that are claiming this hurricane is manufactured, like this is going to make the dark ages. If we went back to the dark ages and explained that somebody thought there was a hurricane gun that the Democrats were shooting at the country to affect the election, they would be like, man, you guys are off your rockers. And these are people that believe like God was doing bleedings with hail on them or whatever. And it's like, That's where we're at. And this is the 21st century. So I don't know how we defeat this except truth, but it's god awful maddening.
Well, it is, and I think that you can probably appreciate as well as anyone that look, I grew up in it, but I left probably 2015. You had to live in the belly of the beast for far longer than I did. Is that even when we defeat Donald Trump and J.D. Vance on November 5th, it's not like the fight is over. To your point, like the poison has seeped through. And you could make an argument, Adam, again, as someone who's run for and succeeded in electoral office for many years, is that in the 2026 congressional primaries, the number one thing for people to get is probably still going to be Donald Trump's endorsement or his imprimatur at the very least. And you could even make an argument that if he doesn't run in 2028, they'll all be waiting to see if they can get that. Because remember that J.D. Vance only won his primary by 1 point in Ohio, right? And it was because Trump came in at the end. It still only saved him by 1 point, but it's not going away. And a friend of ours, Dan Barkoff, who former Navy SEAL, said, this could take 30 years to root out. And I think that's one thing, again, is maybe because we've just been dealing with it so long, we understand what it is we're up against, is that Kamala Harris, Tim Walz win on November 5th. It's not like it's a magic wand and MAGA, fades into the background. If anything, all of these people who've spent decades and billions of dollars building this stuff up, it's not like they're going to fold up their tents.
No, they're not. And this is what's an important message is, we always talk about this. I always talk about this on this awkward alliance, right, between the sane right, the center, and the left. And this is what you do such a good job of bringing people together on. This is a battle. So, this is like Gettysburg, for us historians to say, we've got to beat Donald Trump in this election. It could be a turning point in the fight. It really could.
Right.
But there's 2 years of fight in front of us. And politically, I think there's much longer than that. Because again, people's brains have been poisoned. And to an extent, and I have trouble doing this, but we need to find compassion for some of these people that have been lied to and abused and truly believe this stuff. I don't know how to deprogram because honestly, I don't have the patience to do it. If you think that they're shooting a gun with hurricanes in it from Cancun, I don't know how to be compassionate to you about that. But at the same time, we've got to recognize that is a process. And I think some of it is, we all have baby boomers we love, but the baby boomer generation is deep in conspiracy. But the problem is the young generation now is deep in conspiracy, not the Xers, not the millennials, the Gen Zs. And so, how do we get back to that truth? But this is going to be, and this is where this coalition that we have is going to have to endure, because it's going to have to take election defeat after election defeat until ultimately they can spout on Twitter, but they're just never going to get the power they desire to have. And I'll say to the Democrats out there, this is why you have to be accepting of moderates and even some conservative Democrats. I get it. You'll disagree on guns and abortion. I get it. But that's a luxury to disagree on those things if our actual democracy is at risk.
Well, it's interesting you say that on the idea of values, Adam, because I was just in Michigan this past weekend, and I've had this thought, and I've tried to explain it to some of our Democratic friends, that if you look at the Democratic coalition, you peel off the educated elites from the coasts. You have, African Americans, you have Latinos, which covers an entire continent, and you have South Asian, East Asian, again, that covers an entire continent, in dozens of nationalities. And I think the one thing that our Democratic friends miss is that their coalition is really more culturally conservative than I think they understand or they want to believe. That, to your point, there are a lot of big social issues that are the big fight every year, cycle in and cycle out, that even their own constituencies aren't entirely comfortable with. It's not to say they're anti anything. It's that in the world in which they live, they have, call it kitchen table issues, call it, family issues, call it whatever the case might be. And I think that's one thing, to your point, is to our Democratic friends, if you want to have a big tent, you must have a much bigger door for it.
That's right.
And I'll tell you this. I mean, look, you've been all over the country. I've been all over the country. And I'm sure you have friends like this. I know I do. Is the middle-aged white guy and the younger white guy, they want nothing to do with the Democratic Party. And I don't think it's necessarily because they're MAGA inherently, Adam, but I think it's because the Democratic Party has said to a lot of them, we don't want you here.
Yes. Yeah, listen, So I went to Nevada to do kind of a labor roundtable. I was always a pro-union Republican, and
Sure.
as Illinoisans are. And I was talking to these labor leaders that are for Harris, and they were saying, look, they go onto job sites and their union membership will yell at them because they're starting to push Kamala Harris. And
Right.
he's like, how do we push back on this? So I gave some advice on it, but I'm like, what are the issues they're pushing back on? And they're like, guns is a big one, and the border is a huge one, right?
Right.
And so I think the Democrats are doing a smart job, and Kamala's done a smart job on the border issue, and Colin Allred in Texas, where I'm at now,
Sure.
basically saying the border is a problem. Now, is it going to make an impact this November? I don't know, but if you keep hammering this, it will. But the other issue, and thankfully I think some of this has gone away, but there's a tail to it, which is how many times were we told 5 years ago that all masculinity is toxic masculinity?
Right.
And as men, we are built to defend our family. We're built to fight. Now the question is, are you going to fight for a bad cause or a good cause? That's what masculinity is, defending the defenseless. And when you're told that all masculinity is toxic, I think it created a real anger in particularly white men, and particularly younger white men, that, again, I think the Democrats have recognized it and they're making efforts to come back to it, but they have to keep doing that. I just think that's why you're losing so many men at this point.
Right. Yeah, I think that's right. And I've told this story before, but, I have a friend whose daughter's in law school there in Austin, just up the road from you. And, she's got a lot of, young white guys in her class. And she said, they're not necessarily MAGA. They're not even necessarily big fans of Donald Trump, but they just don't feel like the Democrats want him. So, it's Texas, so you can take it for what it is. But that's the point is, I think that the idea of, well, we don't want you in our coalition is not a good way to win, right? It's not a good way to grow, especially because all of the things that you just mentioned that we used to believe in, or we thought we believed in, or we thought the GOP believed in, all that stuff is sitting out there waiting for somebody to go pick up, because the first of all, I think the majority of the Democratic Party is probably aligned with us. And, it's not a very broad Venn diagram, but, rural areas, ex-urban areas, just on the value proposition alone of things, I think that the Democratic Party, and I think we saw this, you spoke at the convention. I was there. I think the Democrats, at least who was running the convention, like the USA signs, the flag signs, like that stuff matters. Going back to your Red Dawn thing, look, I agree with you. It's one of my favorite movies. I call it a documentary, but we don't have to, right? But like, who didn't want to be a Wolverine?
Yeah.
Who didn't want to believe that America, to your point about greatness in the world? And I think that's the other part too, is you have lived as I've said, and the listeners have heard this, is Republicans fight on value propositions, not on issues. What does it mean? What is the value proposition for the United States to be a leader in the world?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And look, Donald Trump has left a lot of real estate in play, that American pride. The reality is Donald Trump is not a proud American, and Republicans aren't proud Americans. They're proud of this pretend America they think existed 30, 40 years ago that really probably didn't. But as America exists today, they hate it. They've made it clear they hate America today. And for the Democrats in Kamala to come in and say, no, we're proud of our country. We're proud of everybody. I think the white guys for Kamala thing is kind of weird, but it also sends a message, which is, hey, we actually do value you. And I think all of that is important because, look, again, yes, in 30 days, this fight's not over. And are we going to continue to build this coalition? And the question is, does another party pop up and replace the Republican Party? It's difficult to do. Or do the Democrats want to actually have a broad enough coalition that they win basically every race they're in? And I think the indications early are pretty good from Democrats in terms of understanding that. I just worry that after this election, there's going to be a deep breath and they're going to be like, good, we're safe now. And we can go back to disagreeing on tax rates. And we just can't.
Right. No, and I know I always feel, I even call myself your friendly neighborhood Cassandra, because I'm like, it's not over. It's not over. But I think remember, this is a guy who served in Congress long before you did. Another Texan, Charlie Wilson, was from East Texas. I think he represented Texas 1 millions of years ago. But he was the definition of a blue dog Democrat, right? He was not a progressive. He was not a liberal. He was a conservative Democrat from a conservative area. But he won and won and won and won and won because, again, his values align with wherever the hell he was from, Longview or Tyler or wherever it was. So that is absolutely possible. And it should be possible. And, I was talking to a friend, probably a mutual friend of ours this morning, Adam, and I asked that question is like, where do we go from here? Right. To your point. Look, I tried to start a third party. Neither the Republicans nor the Democrats want that. Right. Let's just be very candid. But like, where do we go? How do we stay together? Is it a loose confederation where we're all marching in the same direction? Is it something more formalized? I frankly don't know the answer, but I know this. I'll use another military, history piece. Is like we're sort of like the British Army in World War I, right? We're not French, we're not from France, but the Germans can't take Paris.
Yeah.
Right. Like we're the left wing of the army. And I feel like, to your point, like I don't necessarily, maybe we don't have to name it, Adam, right? Maybe we don't have to have a group, but maybe we do have to agree on a certain set of things, which is like, okay, what do we need to do? How can we help? And understand that like we're here to help, not because we're Democrats, but because we're small d Democrats, because we care. And as you know better than anyone, it's not like any of us can go back, right? It's not like, oh, well, yeah, look, I got sick of dealing with Democrats, so I'm going to go be a Republican again.
Well, by the way, so many people have done that. I mean, you look at the members of Congress that started out as like anti-Trumpers that just got fatigued and they're all in now. I mean, I could name a dozen of them. It's sad. Yeah. But as regular Americans, like, yeah, look, it's, I also don't know what comes next, but I know that, Americans, what's the verse in the Bible? It's like, if nobody worships God, the rocks will cry out. Like, if you feel unrepresented for so long, you're going to do something because, we're Americans. Like, we want to know that we have an input. And, and I think for now, it's helping the Democrats where we can. To my Democratic friends, listen, if your demand is that we line up with you philosophically, guess what? You are maybe less authoritarian, but not a lot different than the Republicans if that is your demand. If your demand is you have to come here and agree with everything we do to be a member, okay. I mean, look, you don't have a Donald Trump. That's great. But that's what the Republicans are doing. Be different and be bigger than that. And recognize that, look, every country, every self-governing country needs a right and a left movement. They it's like this dance, right, that moves the country along at the right pace. You need that. We don't have a healthy right movement right now.
No, I mean, think about in 2004 when I worked for then President Bush on his reelect and we were running against John Kerry. And like, it was a national security election, obviously. But when the argument came to tax rates, it was like, Bush is for 34.6 and Kerry's for 39.1, right? Like these were the issues we argued about.
Yep.
And that seems, it's a different country, literally and figuratively. All right. So let me ask you this. So, I've talked to the folks listening about being out on the road. Tell us a little bit about what your experience out there has been.
So in 2015, maybe you saw this coming. I didn't. I thought that there was no way Trump would win. And, we can look back at 2017 and say, okay, yeah, there was definitely a wave there that we didn't see coming. People wanted to break the system.
Right.
So you don't really see these kinds of movements until they're passed. But I'm sensing that there's a real desire underneath to like heal the system, to fix the system. And I think Kamala is tapping onto a little bit of that. I just don't think the wave and the demand is fully developed yet. I think it will be in 2028 when people are just sick of it and they're ready for somebody to come along and be optimistic. Let's call it a Ronald Reagan or an Obama. Like, take your pick. That's that kind of a communicator. And so she's benefiting from the early part of that wave. It's just not full yet. But that's what I'm sensing out there is that people are fatigued. There's not a single group I talk to where I say, like, are you guys happy with what's going on? Of course, they all say no. They're all tired. And I don't know, man. I think there's a pot of power, I guess is the best way to say it, for somebody that's willing to come along and be optimistic and paint people a vision. And Kamala may be that person. If she ends up winning in November and wins big, she can even continue to develop that. But if for whatever reason she isn't able to grab onto that, there is that demand out there, I think. And are you seeing the same thing?
It's a good question. I mean, yes, I think so. I was in Western Michigan in Grand Rapids and, talking to the Kent County Democratic Party. And interesting enough, how many of their leaders, and they have built a heck of an organization out there, but really weren't involved in politics until Hillary lost. And then they said they got off their couches and they said, I've got to do something. And they built one heck of an organization. Go to the other end of the spectrum and in a heavily African-American neighborhood, talking to a guy who's, we're knocking on doors. And I think this is another thing for all of us who spend a lot of time looking into cameras and talking to microphones, Adam, is that just because someone lives in a rough neighborhood does not make them uninformed. This gentleman knew exactly what was going on. He knew exactly what the stakes were, but here's how he saw the world. Kamala is the slight lesser of two evils.
Yeah.
He didn't like Trump because he sees Trump as just wanting power and he doesn't want that, but he wasn't hearing it either. And so I think that's the other part too is, these folks I was talking to were all registered, right? You don't need to really, this gentleman was ultimately he's going to vote for Harris, but there's also a part of this that's like work, real work, which is to get that he's probably a low mid propensity voter, but to make sure he participates. Like, you can't ask him for his vote 2 months out of every 2 years. There has to be a conversation with him about the issues facing him, because this is what I also heard when I was in, 2 different black churches yesterday. Every year, things go on. They say you got to do this. It's the most important thing. And too many of our people's lives don't change.
Yep.
Right.
Yep.
And that's a failure on all of us. And so I think, to your point, that's right. But with the enthusiasm and the wave, that I think is a very interesting point you make, also has to come with some concrete stuff, which I think, frankly, Joe Biden has really done.
Yep.
Right. He really put his money where his mouth is. He's not flashy. He's not fancy. He's not a rock star. He just goes, and this, like working in Congress, he just went in there and did the work and got the stuff done.
Yeah. The problem with that is you have to communicate what you've done. And either Joe Biden and his team weren't great at communicating that, or we're just at a moment, and I don't know the answer to this, or we're just at a moment where the culture war is the thing that just overpowers everything. So you can say, look, the economy is great, and people are like, fine, it doesn't feel great because Fox News told me it wasn't great, or the border's wide open, or you're coming to take my guns, or you're launching hurricanes at the United States, whatever it is, like these conspiracy culture wars may be overpowering that. And that's what I hope. I hope the exhaustion sets in, particularly about the lies and conspiracies, because, what does a conspiracy do if you believe it? It puts your car engine on red line. And so you're angry, you're storming around. I can't believe these people. But eventually, when you keep your engine on red line for so long, it'll break down. And I've got to imagine that there's a point. The vast majority of Americans are smart, and they're smart enough to know that, when they're being lied to, that's a bad thing. And so when they can get out of that, darkness, maybe see a light. I don't know. That's what I hope, because I honestly, outside of that, I'm not sure what the answer is.
No, look, I think beating Trump is Winston Churchill said, is the end of the beginning.
Yeah.
Right. It's the first biggest hurdle we have to climb. All right. So here we are, 4 weeks or so out. What are you going to be doing? How do you see things? Where are you going to be going?
I'm not determined yet where, but I'll be doing a couple days still for Kamala to get out there, and, whether it's particularly a Republicans for Harris or just being with her, I don't know. And then I'm continuing to help Colin Allred here in Texas. My organization, Country First, and then my leadership pack, I'm supporting a lot of, frankly, it's just Democrats right now, because my view is there's no Republicans. I'll support a ton of Republicans in the primary, but there's none left. The price of entry is fealty to Donald Trump, and I won't support that. And so helping out a lot of those candidates. And what I'm watching for is, look, here's my prediction for this is going to sound totally but it's the best way to put it. It's either going to be close, or else Kamala's going to blow them away. And, the thing I'm hoping for is that these pollsters are, kind of being conservative on Democratic enthusiasm because they don't want to be embarrassed again. And I think there is I don't know how big it is, there is a little bit of that reverse 2016 where there are Republicans that would never admit they aren't going to vote for Trump because they know what the cost is, that maybe in that ballot box will pull the trigger for Harris. So I don't know. I think it's a dead nuts even, right? But there is a chance it could be a blowaway, and that would be a blowaway in modern standards, not in old standards. And that would be magic. That would be a great day, and I would definitely drink whiskey in celebration.
Right. Well, look, I think you're right. I have always thought, even when President Biden was still running, that there were more voters available to the Democratic nominee than there are to Donald Trump. Donald Trump's ceiling has continuously been 45, 46% nationally, which is why you saw these other nutcases, roaming around, and why you see, you heard him say at his rally, right? I wouldn't admit it if I were a Kamala Harris voter. That could be very dangerous. None of this stuff, as you've been through it personally, as much, if not more than anybody, Adam, is it's lies, it's deceit, it's disinformation, misinformation, and there's just straight out threats and violence because he's desperate, right? All of the things he's done over the course of the last 50 plus years are coming home to roost on November 6th if he loses. And he's that methed out Tasmanian devil, and he's just scared to death at this point. And we just have to, keep our wits about us, keep our heads about us. I'm sure you've been in a cockpit sometime when you had an emergency, and the last thing you want to do is flip out, right? Because that's not going to work. And so you have to just understand what your situation is, account for what's going on, figure out how to get out of it. And then, guys, we can and we will do this. Adam, before we let you go, where can our folks find your work? Where can we find you on social media? Is there a place we can track where you're traveling so we know when we can find you?
Yeah, so I'm pretty open about it on Adam Kinzinger on Twitter, and then I've got a Substack, Adam Kinzinger on Substack, that I write a lot on. And those are the big ones. And then my organization, country1st.com, countryfirst.com, and we'll keep everybody posted. And I emo tweet a little too much, so sometimes you'll see how angry I am. Yep.
As always, gang, you can find me on Twitter and TikTok at Reed Galen, on Threads and Instagram at Reed_Galen USA, and also on Substack at The Homefront. Adam Kinzinger, thanks for joining me.
You bet. Great to be with you. Thanks.
Everybody else, we'll see you next time.